Good afternoon and welcome to this De Gruyter webinar, New Now, New Normal, New Next. And thank you so much for signing up to it. We have more attendees at this one than any of the others in the series. I believe there are about 270 of you joining, so thank you very much indeed. My name's Linda Bennett and I'm the founder of Gold Leaf, which is a small consultancy. My colleague Annika and I have been working closely with De Gruyter for several years now. And we're very, very happy to be taking part in this webinar, which is about the effects of the pandemic on libraries and research. And we have some very distinguished librarian speakers, Helen A.D., Dr. Gernot Deinzer, and Professor Michael Levine-Clark, I should say, and also Deirdre Watchorn, who's the Customer Insights Manager at De Gruyter. So before we start, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Helen, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
By all means. Hello, I'm Helen Adey. I am Resource Acquisition and Supply Team Manager at Nottingham Trent University in the UK.
Thank you. And Gernot?
Hello, my name is Gernot Deinzer. I'm from the library of the university in Regensburg. I'm here responsible for open access and IT services. And actually, I'm also a member of several national and international working groups about open access.
Thank you. And Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Levine-Clark. I'm the Dean of Libraries at the University of Denver in Colorado. The scene behind me is about an hour west of here.
Thank you. And Deirdre?
Hi, I'm Deirdre Watchorn. I'm the Senior Insights Manager at De Gruyter, based in a very rainy Berlin today, and work very closely with Gold Leaf, as I said, with the talking to librarians and the Librarian Advisory Board.
Thank you. And also on the call, we have Annika, who's my colleague, and she's going to help to field the questions as we get them. And Lavinia, who works for De Gruyter, she's actually based in Singapore, and she's going to manage the slides. So we just have a few protocols for you to start with. So your audio and video will be turned off during the presentations, and the webinar will be recorded, which I think we've already told you. So if you want to ask a question, please post it into chat, and Annika will field the questions to me, and she'll try to sort out similar questions so that we answer as many types of question as possible. But we will also, if your question isn't fielded and you'd like to email Lavinia afterwards, we will try and get an answer for you after the webinar. And just for the speakers, if you could turn off your Outlook and Teams files, because we may be able to see them otherwise when you're speaking. And just a quick run through the agenda. Welcome and introductions we've just done. Deirdre is going to talk about some research that De Gruyter and Gold Leaf did together on the impact of the COVID crisis on librarians around the world. And then Helen's going to speak about the impact on the UK and teaching and learning particularly. Michael's going to talk about the impact on libraries and research in the US. And Gernot's going to talk about open access, particularly within the German context. And then we'll have a question and answer session after that. So I'm going to ask Deirdre to pitch straight in now and to give her presentation. Deirdre, thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm happy to be kicking off this webinar today, and really as a scene setter to talk about some of the research that we've been doing. Now, since the start of the crisis, my team have been talking regularly with customers and librarians around the world to get a sense of what are the key concerns that have been impacting everyday work. We've been working with our Library Advisory Board, we've been conducting interviews with librarians, and the research I'm going to talk about today is two surveys that we've run. The first one back in May, really at the beginning of the crisis, and the second survey, so very similar questions that we've just finished asking about in this September, so about 2 weeks ago, so hot off the press as it were. We wanted to understand and really just track sentiment to understand how things are changing and what the key stress points are for librarians in different regions around the world. As I said, the first survey was run back in May, and that was run by Gold Leaf, and the second one is just finished. The survey was emailed to 100 senior librarians worldwide, And they were mostly acquisitions librarians, but the sample also includes some university librarians and deputy university librarians. And also some of the sample are also from our librarian advisory board. I'm not sure if you can see the breakdown on the right there, but we had about 50 respondents in each of the surveys, and we had a range from 18 to 25 countries taking part. So a real global sample, quite a small sample overall, but that was quite intended to just keep it quite consistent from the different rounds, but very global sample overall. What I'd now like to do is just pull out 5 key facts or 5 interesting learnings that we found out from the survey, really to set the scene before going into the next presentations. So the first finding, more librarians are starting to feel under pressure than at the start of the crisis, which is actually quite interesting. So we asked, the first question was, how is the current situation making you feel on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not at all stressed and 10 is very stressed. And actually what we're seeing from May to September is that about a third of librarians, it's actually consistently high stress. The situation hasn't really changed for them. But what we are seeing is that for some librarians who weren't particularly stressed at the beginning of the crisis, we're now moving up into that middle of the range from saying that they're at 5 to 7 stress. So things are becoming a bit more acutely stressed for more librarians. So over 80% of people are now becoming, more stressed, as it were. So what are the things that are stressing librarians? The first things on the top of we asked a whole range of statements and asked people to tell us, this time on a scale of 1 to 5, how stressed they were about these things. And the top 3 things, budget cuts and the problems associated with them, managing workloads, and new and further lockdowns. They were the top 3 things. And obviously the survey, the most recent survey, we asked 2 weeks ago, and that was before some regions were moving into the next wave of lockdowns that have happened since. So they are the key things that are worrying librarians. Also then in the next tier of statements, it's all about providing resources. So we know how important it is to provide a high level of service to patrons, and whether that's to researchers or undergraduates, doesn't make any difference, it's still very important. But also providing access to print collections, that's very important as well. In the bottom level of statements, we see a range of different things, some related to juggling home responsibilities, poor health, risk of redundancy. So actually it's quite good that these things are quite low down, because they obviously would have a detrimental effect on librarians. And what we see is from May to September, the things that are concerning librarians is actually very consistent. So the top 3 things are very consistent. The 2 big shifts we have seen are global uncertainty. So I wonder if the worries are more about what's happening locally in my library, in my institution, in my area, rather than what's happening on a global stage. And also student numbers. So there was a lot of discussion at the start of the crisis that students would stop going to university and we'd see fewer registrations. And we know that since then, to some extent, the opposite has been true. And we're now seeing more students in some regions who are signing up. So that's less of a concern that it was so in May. Interesting finding number 3. Now we know that budget cuts they're a key factor year on year, but is this another year, or is this quite a different year? And I think we know that this is a year like no other. So the top statement here, we can see that I'm expecting library budget cuts in the next fiscal year to be more severe than in recent years. And over 80% of librarians in this survey agreed with that. So yes, this is not just another budget cut, something severe is going to happen. Although interestingly, in all the regions, we had slightly lower concern in Germany versus elsewhere. At the same time, there's still a lot of people saying, I don't actually know how things are going to be affected. So gut feel is that they are going to be quite severe, but it's still too early to really tell. There are so many different factors. Things are changing on such a regular basis that you just don't know. However, North America, because of where they are on the year, they're more likely to say, actually, we do have a good idea of what's going to happen. And in many cases, that's not particularly positive. The last statement that we asked about in this survey was to understand whether there would be additional resources dedicated to supporting digital, the digital transformation. And actually we're not seeing that to be the case at the moment. So there's no additional resources being given to the purchase of digital. In terms of who librarians expect to be negatively impacted the most, we can see in the top statement there that the big expectation is that undergraduates will be negatively impacted the most. So we've got over 60% agreeing with that. And we have the highest levels of agreement in North America and APAC, although it was less of a concern in Germany, although admittedly the semester is only about to start in Germany. So maybe in a few weeks' time, we might see a very different picture. So the focus, I think, as we'll come on to talk about, there's going to be a lot of talk about teaching and learning and how important that is, especially for new students starting, and maybe potentially less of an issue for researchers. But it'll be interesting to discuss what librarians have got to say on that. And the final learning part of this presentation here for me, amid the crisis, there are some silver linings. So firstly, an openness to new ways of working. So this is what we've heard consistently from librarians throughout the crisis. There's a new imperative for faculty to accept and embrace ebooks and other electronic resources following lockdown. And we've also seen this particularly amongst humanities researchers and students who've always preferred print previously. The crisis has also led to greater flexibility and other advantages of working from home. One of the quotes here, some more time for my own research, that came through from one librarian. And one quote from a UK librarian, the crisis has pushed forward elements of library, I can't read that, automation and remote working that should have happened years ago. So although this is a terrible year, there are one or two silver linings and things are happening, and things are happening at much quicker pace than they have previously. The second silver lining is pride. So pride in what librarians have achieved this year. So the feedback we've had is that librarians have pride in the speed that they've been able to react. So there's been development of new services, the way that print books have been offered to patrons, creating new digital content. So all of this has happened in such a quick space of time. Whereas in the past, it could have been years. It could have taken years for this to happen. This idea that everyone's pulled together in the time of a crisis. So there's been a lot of increased focus on collaboration with colleagues and more positive relationships with publishers. This is what librarians are telling us. And there's also been this focus on core and digital services. So focus on what is really important, as well as this recognition of what is important, what the key responsibilities for librarians. So the crisis overall has led to a greater awareness of the importance of libraries and their role in the higher education ecosystem. And I'd like to finish this presentation with a really nice quote we got from a librarian in Germany. So a crisis is not an adventure that makes us happy, but there have always been some kind of romanticism around catastrophes. Yes, we have to learn a lot of things, but we have to practice a lot of things. But sometimes the old and the new build a high mountain and the top is hard to reach. Thank you very much.
I want to take most of the questions after all the speakers have spoken, but I will take one question for each speaker in between presentations, if there is one. So does anyone have a question for Deirdre? If not, we'll move straight on. Okay, I don't think we've got a question for you yet, Deirdre. So Helen, would you like to start now, please? Thank you.
By all means, yes, thank you. So it's a bold statement to say I'm going to speak on behalf of the UK, but nonetheless, that's what I'm going to try and do this afternoon. So next slide, please. So very quickly, I'm going to look back briefly to the start of the lockdown when the situation was anything but normal. We seem to be making up new things on a daily basis. Before going on to talk about how we've planned for the new year, how that has impacted and changed teaching and learning, what it's meant for library planning and resource management. because I'm speaking primarily as a manager of a team who buys content for the university libraries and makes content available. So that would be very much my focus for that bit. And then talk briefly about some new initiatives, both national deals and some grassroots movements that are starting to emerge, particularly on the pricing of core textbook materials, before being even more brave and trying to predict where we'll go next. So next slide, please. So very briefly, for those of you who may not have heard of Nottingham Trent University, Nottingham is a city in the centre of England. It's about as far away from the sea as you can possibly get. Nottingham Trent University became a university in 1992, but prior to that we'd been a polytechnic, and some of our antecedents in terms of being an educational institution go back to 1843. We have 4 campuses, and in UK terms we are big. We've got over 30,000 students. And the fact that it's only emerged in the last 2 weeks, and it's a dubious claim to fame, but Nottingham as a city has the highest rate of COVID infections in the UK as we speak. So that is very much an emerging issue that we are trying to deal with at the moment. Next slide, please. So, yes, immediately after in the aftermath of the lockdown, I think in retrospect, we probably didn't recognize this for what it's worth, but there was a very real sense of shock amongst our students when the libraries closed, which in some respects, when you think about it, is quite a compliment. They just expect the library always to be there, always to be open, always to be running. And when Boris Johnson stood up on March the 23rd and said we all needed to stay at home, I think for many students they thought, well, okay, yeah, but not the library. They just assumed that we were going to be there, which is quite a nice compliment in some ways. But what this meant, I think, for libraries in the UK, and this is a sweeping generalisation, I know, is that in spite of the fact that our buildings were closed, our services were very much still up and running. You know, we were quickly adapting to, the vagaries of learning, working from home with dodgy Wi-Fi and having to work in teenage children's bedrooms because they've got the strongest signal. So apologies for my background. But lots of universities were trying to work out, or lots of libraries were trying to work out, how are we going to approach supporting our academics, our undergraduates and our postgraduates and researchers when we're not physically in the building and we don't have access to our print materials. So for many, that meant they were going to rely on their existing electronic materials, and the quantity of that varies enormously in the UK. Nottingham Trent has had an e-first policy for over a decade now, so we've got very strong electronic collections, but that's not necessarily the case across all institutions. And we were very, very grateful, I think, for the fact that because I think most people expected a lockdown was going to come, there had been quite a lot of prior planning. So even before the lockdown came, JISC, in conjunction with many, many academic publishers, announced the free student e-textbook programme, which made our lives tremendously, much easier, because at least we had access to some content that previously we wouldn't have been able to make available online. And even aside from the FSTP, we had publishers who were sort of falling over themselves to make content available, and that did make a massive difference into what we could do. Because certainly from Nottingham Trent's point of view, one of the things we realised very quickly was, because the libraries were closed, we had our academics and researchers and students, they were all putting in requests for things through the only open request service, which is actually our interlibrary loan service. And they were asking for things, can you get me this, for resources that were actually on the shelves locked behind doors in Nottingham. So we realised that if we were going to stop that very small team, the document supply team, from being deluged, we needed to launch very, very quickly a new service whereby our customers could request an online version for materials that were only available in print. Because certainly in the UK, interlibrary lending ceased, the bookshops were closed, even Amazon was slow in delivering things. So, if you needed content and you needed it quickly, we had to react quickly and try and, get the service up and running. And, obviously from a teaching learning point of view, work immediately started on converting all teaching to be online only from term 3. Next slide, please. So putting this to one side then, what happened when shutdown first started? Very quickly, the university sort of leapt into action to try and plan how it was going to approach teaching for the new academic year, which for Nottingham Trent, we are now in week 2 of the 2020-21 year. And we had estates people who were trying to work out what the capacity was going to be, if we were going to have, social distancing, if that was going to be the reality when we reopened. We had to look at what space we'd got and how we could do teaching. And if we were going to start doing both some face-to-face and online teaching, then we needed people who got the necessary e-learning skills and technology skills to support our academics to make that transition. Because I think the university recognised that, there's online teaching and there's online teaching. It needs to be more than just a Zoom lecture for it to be a rich experience for students. And what we're aiming for was something that students could recognise, that even when it was online and it wasn't face-to-face, it was still engaging and it was still an immersive experience. And we worked very closely with those teams who were helping and advising academics. And we managed to get a statement into the sort of policy documents that said the core materials, learning materials, books, journals that they wanted to use for this new academic year should be available in online or electronic format. We didn't say must, we said should, because we were at least realists, but we were trying to set out our expectation that they would be moving towards adopting online materials. And we offered them help and support from our learning and teaching librarians in identifying suitable alternative resources if their preferred content wasn't available online. And all of this was in preparation for the new academic year. And in the meantime, the library teams continued to be offering a service. We have bookable one-to-one online appointments. We had online chat. We had email services. Going back to what I was saying, the building may be closed, but the service is very much still up and running. That was all still continuing as usual. Next slide, please. So, very quickly, once we got over the immediate shock of close down and launching new new services, we started to consider how we were going to support all of our customers. You may not know this, but in the UK, libraries legally, we were in the category of buildings which were considered to be at higher risk. So we weren't able legally to open until early July. So we started to work out how might we still offer some services, and like many different other universities, we launched a click and collect service, so you could request an item and then as soon as the libraries were open you could come in and collect them. We started to work on repurposing our spaces so that we take account of social distancing and the need to quarantine print. And we recognised quickly that that was going to have an impact on both study space and print collections. And to give you some sense, we estimate that we have lost somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of our study space capacity because of the needs of social distancing. We also need to be able to demonstrate that we've got an effective track and trace system in, so that if somebody comes into the library and then tests positive for COVID-19, we need to be able to report that, and so that people that they may have come into contact with can be contacted as well. So we now have a booking system for entries into the libraries, so that helps manage that's demand on space. And the service that we offered, which we thought was going to be in the interim, the request and online version service, continues to be heavily used. Going back to what I said about Nottingham's got one of the highest rates in COVID infections in the UK, the reports at the moment are that the campus and the libraries are eerily quiet, but the request for an online version has gone through the roof. They're coming in hundreds a day. So it looks as if students are staying put or they're self-isolating in some way, and they're requesting resources from us. And that's okay where we can satisfy them as an individual request, but where we've got still a reliance on core reading list materials that are still only available in print. We've got cohorts in our business school that are 1,500, 2,000 plus. We're not going to be able to send out 1,500 copies to those. So that is a service that is very much under pressure. And in the last couple of weeks, we've been keeping a very close eye on it and trying to work out how do we manage this going forward. So one of the issues for us is that a lot of the content that is in core demand is only available as an e-textbook. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this, this is an ebook licensing model where the pricing is based on the number of students who you want to access it and the period of time over which you're going to buy it. So it's not like a library ebook license where you might be able to buy it with a number of credits or a number of concurrent users. This is content that usually would be locked down and only available through your virtual learning environment. And typically, Nottingham Trent has not engaged with this type of material because we think it runs counter to our core belief that the library budget should be spent on resources that are available to everybody, and we shouldn't be really getting involved in content that is only discoverable by a certain number of students. And really, I think the recognition amongst UK librarians about how reliant they were on a lot of this really in-demand content has led to joint collective calls from the likes of JISC, who are the primary licensing body in the UK on behalf of UK higher education, Universities UK, the Society of College and National and University Libraries and Research Libraries UK have issued a joint call to all providers of digital content to try and help institutions to maintain their teaching and learning activity, whether that's by making some content available free where it's possible or having price increases that are level with last year. And to this end, JISC have now negotiated a national e-textbook agreement. This is the first and pilot year, but it's meant to run for 3 years. Very, very quickly, from my perspective, it's an immensely complex agreement and it is eye-wateringly expensive. So it's not necessarily a solution, I don't think. Just to give you some sort of idea, to take advantage of that new agreement fully, I would need something like a 200% increase in my book budget. So that's the sort of scale that we're talking about. So next slide, please. I think we've gone back one, so forward 2 if possible. Oh, so can you go back one? Yeah. You're going forward now. Could you go backwards one, please? Yeah, okay. So that grassroots campaign, I think at heart, you know, librarians are radicals and they've got together and there is a current campaign and indeed a petition that the government should investigate the academic ebook market for the reasons that you see there. This core belief that in some cases, not all cases, but some academic publishing practices are making ebooks unaffordable, unsustainable and inaccessible to university libraries, and a call for urgent regulation of the market. There's a link in my slides if you want to investigate this further. I think you've got another week if you want to sign the petition, but it is gaining ground and a very real response, I think, to the fact that so much of this content that our lecturers want to use and our undergraduates want to access is just out of our ability to pay for it. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what next? I think some changes will become the new normal. There will be more working from home for non-frontline teams. The office that my team occupy is now teaching and learning space, so we have no office to go back to even if we wanted to. I think the blended approach to teaching and learning is going to be a long-standing change. Somebody said to me yesterday that the university feels that actually this approach that we've got to teaching and learning this year is where we wanted to be at in any case. It's just that COVID has speeded up that, you know, the adoption of that sort of approach. We saw from the survey, pressure on budgets, I think, is not going to go away. And I think in the light of this, I think there is going to continue to be pressure on academic publishing to move away from print and pricing that's based on that, you know, an outdated sense of print supply where, you know, each person has their own copy. But critically, student satisfaction is going to be a critical factor. Next one, please. I think other changes are less clear. We're starting to pick up some concern amongst the students. Even before they came, you know, there were some 18-year-olds who were wondering if they were going to get what they called the full university experience. I think what they're referring to there is not stuff that the library or even the university provides. It's the sort of social experience, the living with people in houses, the getting to grips with budgeting, all that sort of thing. Will it continue to be as an attractive proposition if they don't get that? Excuse me. And what's the role of the library, as we're starting to see academics who are wanting to move beyond standard print and e-resources to sort of interactive and courseware resources. What's the library's role if that's what they want to do? In effect, they want to sort of teaching materials rather than materials to support it. And what skills and support will our students need to become effective online learners? Excuse me. Next slide, please. So there's some links to the documents and sites that I've mentioned in my presentation. Next slide, please. Unfortunately for everybody, that's my time finished, but I'll happy to take any questions now or later. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, very much. That was great. We have got one question. I'm only allowing one question in between presentations. So the question is, can you see that question, Helen, or do you want me to read it out?
No, I can't see it. Sorry, Linda.
Okay. So it says, with the demand for e-content, has there been a rise in accessibility tools such as read aloud software or an increase in demand that the library offers accessibility tools?
Yes and no. In that, as an acquisitions team, we try to ensure that, you know, what we're buying, excuse me, is fully accessible in any case. What it has had an impact on is more academics who are trying to create content. I think they are having to get to grips with accessibility issues in a way that they've not had to do before. But that's been our experience at any rate.
Thank you very much. So, Michael, would you like to talk about the experience in the USA, focusing more on research than Helen did? Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you. And I just want to say that Helen's experience is very similar to I think what we went through in the U.S. in terms of the pivot to online learning and shutting down the schools and all of the experiences from the teaching and learning perspective. So while I'm not going to talk about that, I do want to just echo some of that experience. I also want to say, just as a way of context, that it's important to understand that unlike in the UK, where the Prime Minister ordered a shutdown, things don't work that way in the US. And I'll just say, on the federal level, no comment. But on the state and local level, it's equally complicated, right? So we had some states that were really fairly aggressive in shutting things down, and some states that were absolutely not. And then we had cities that were either more or less restrictive in terms of shutting it down than the state that they were part of. We had some states where there were cities that tried to shut things down, but the states actually overrode the cities to some extent. So there's a sort of a peculiar overlapping in jurisdictions in the US that I think is really important to acknowledge, because that factors into how things played out across the country. So next.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. So just I wanted to start off by talking about money, because I think, first of all, the US higher education revenue structure, I think, is a little more complicated than in other countries, but also because it's really important to understanding where we are in terms of funding and where we're going to be in terms of funding over the next several years. So we have multiple different revenue streams in higher education in the US. There is obviously tuition, and tuition varies, right? So there are private schools. University of Denver, where I work, is a private institution, so we charge a much higher tuition typically than public schools, the state schools. there are in-state and out-of-state tuitions for the state schools. So the University of Colorado, just up the road from me, has a rate for students from in the state of Colorado, and then they have a rate for out-of-state that's much higher and much more comparable to the high tuition of a school like the University of Denver. Within that, there are variable rates. So we tend to discount, and we rely on some students paying full tuition, but we right off the bat, some students are admitted at a very, very deep discount. And all of that's really important to understand because the way that all plays out has been impacted, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There's room and board as a revenue source, so the dormitories and the food services on campuses. For state schools, for public institutions, the funding that comes from the state is very important. And there was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education just yesterday about the dire state of finances in states and how that's going to affect higher education. Typically, when there are cuts to the budgets at the state level, higher education is disproportionately affected because it is easier, I think, both politically and in terms of thinking through the budget to cut from higher education than it is from, say, K through 12 or other.
Michael, I've lost the sound.
Impact of.
That's better.
Was I lost for a second there, Linda?
Yes, thank you. You're back again.
Okay, sorry about that. Where did I cut off?
I think it was only half a sentence. It's fine.
Okay. Anyway, the state schools are really are hurting now and will be hurting in coming years from that. Many schools have substantial endowments from donations to the institutional budget, and at some schools the endowment release, the annual release from these endowments accounts for a really substantial portion of the budget, and at some it's a very small impact. Schools that have hospitals, just as an example of another revenue stream, generate a lot of money from running these massive hospital systems. And then there's all sorts of auxiliary revenue sources. Athletics is really important, and it's at schools like the University of Michigan, where it's essentially a professional football team at a university. Those schools generate $100 million a year in revenue from football alone. There are conferences and events. There's also community sports, so tennis camps and so on. There are conferences that are held at the university and various events. There's parking, which is a big source of revenue for the institution, and then there are various camps, right? So all of these are things that are impacted by the need to create social distance and to de-densify the campus. Most universities in the US have fewer students this year. It's not true across the board. Some schools are actually doing fairly well in terms of enrollment, but many are down. And even those that are not down in terms of students have more financial need, right? So the discount rate of tuition is increased. And so that student who might have brought in full tuition last year can't bring in full tuition this year. International students tend to bring in full tuition, and if we're admitting fewer international students, that's also a case there. We've de-densified the dorms, and in many cases have rented additional off-campus facilities to provide more dorm space or more room space. So there's an additional expense and a decrease in revenue there. State contributions are down dramatically and will be down probably next year even more dramatically. Right, so it started this year, but it's going to be worse next year. Hospitals have fewer elective surgeries, so the revenue from hospitals is down. And in most cases, these auxiliary revenue sources are down. And in cases of things like conferences and events, it's down 100%. Right, so there's a lot of impacts on our budgets, and I just wanted to lay it out there. So next. We started planning we started planning for the return in the fall almost immediately, right? So in March, we shut down. We spent a few weeks trying to figure out how do you shut down and how do you move online? And then we almost immediately started to think, all right, what are we going to do for summer? What are we going to do for fall? And a lot of universities used this McKinsey and Company scenario planning. And I didn't put a link there, but if you Google coronavirus, how should the US higher education plan for an uncertain future, you'll find this. So basically the scenarios are, should we expect an entirely online year? Should we expect a year where some students are back and then they leave? Should we expect a year where we actually managed to keep students on campus for the entire academic year? And based on those different scenarios, universities planned a bunch of different scenarios. And my university went through this, and I would guess that almost every university went through some variation of this planning exercise. So next slide, please. We've been tracking the outbreaks across the country, and this is a map from the New York Times, but you can find these maps elsewhere. And each one of these dots is a university, and each one of these, I guess it's a black dot with the number next to it is the ones that really have the higher outbreaks. And you can see, that there are some in the 2,000–3,000 student range of outbreaks, and we were. We've all been worried about this and what this means for the ability of universities to continue to offer what Helen described as the sort of this university experience that students want. And frankly, the reason why you're seeing such high numbers at some of these large state schools like the University of Georgia and the University of Alabama is because students were seeking that experience and were spending a lot of time gathering and drinking together. So we've all been paying attention to that. And the good thing is that far fewer universities had to sort of move to an online only experience than I think we were predicting. But still some have, and we're still worried about what happens when students go home for winter break and what happens when we come back in the spring. Next slide. So across the US, we are seeing budget cuts in this current fiscal year, the fiscal year that for most of us ends at the end of June of 2021. And those budget cuts are based on a couple of assumptions. One, that students will be back on campus for this entire academic year, right? So our budgeting for the year that we're in now was based on the assumption that we would have students on campus with social distancing, with fewer students paying for dorms and so on, but still with students on campus. And the other assumption that was sort of there from the beginning was that our revenues for things like events and conferences and parking would be down for the fall for sure, but would recover somewhat in the spring. And that second one is looking less and less likely. And anything that sends students away is obviously going to decrease our revenue streams. So we are all making these contingency cuts for greater cuts in this year when most of us have already experienced budget cuts. We're also all expecting 2 to 3 years of decreased revenue. And I've been talking to librarians who've had cuts as deep as 25%. And a 25% cut to your budget is almost impossible to deal with, right? You have to cut dramatically both personnel and collections. Many more are experiencing 10 to 15% collections cuts. And I think that's just the beginning. So next slide. So onto research. How are our researchers doing, and how are they coped? And I think it's really important to remind everybody that most of our researchers are also teachers, right? So they are teaching the courses at our universities, and they had to convert their courses very suddenly in the spring to sort of finish out online, and then they had to create a new course or essentially convert an entire course for the fall to an online or partially online modality. And so a lot of their time has been expended in thinking through how to convert the way they teach. Our sponsored research, I think, had varying impacts. So the funded research from both government and private funding sources. COVID-related research labs reopened first across the country, and they've experienced expanded funding. And I think if you can do research that is related to the pandemic in some way, you're probably doing pretty well in terms of funding and in terms of being able to keep your lab going. Other labs slowed down, and in some places labs shut down entirely for a while. In other places they slowed very dramatically, and this varies by state. But research labs, generally speaking, had months where they were not at full capacity in terms of operating. Human subjects research has even slower to recover. So where you're working directly with people and have to interact with those people. And across many universities, the total amount of money coming in for external funding for research is down. Not down horribly at every place, but it's certainly down. And here it depends on sort of the mix of funding that your university gets and the types of research that is done. Humanities research, I think, is suffering. Archives are closed. Our print collections are only really slow. We are only just restarting interlibrary loan, and many universities have not yet started interlibrary loan. So just the print material, the text-based research that so many humanities researchers rely on is less available. And those same people who want to do that research, again, are converting their courses to online and thinking through all of that challenge. Anecdotally, I've heard this from a couple of different major STM publishers. There have been far more submissions to STM journals over this time period, right? So their submission rates are up pretty dramatically. But also anecdotally, when I talk to colleagues, researchers on my university and at my wife's university, which is also in Denver, they don't have time for anything but teaching, right? They are just focused on teaching, and they're not doing research. Many universities have added a year or some process for extending the tenure and promotion timeline with this in recognition of just how hard this year is and how much research especially is suffering. So next slide, please. We certainly hope that we as libraries can help our researchers. We are there to support the research and teaching and learning missions of the university, but we spent several months focused on online learning. We spent a good chunk of time from March until now, really, focused on helping the university serve our students, primarily our undergraduate students. And it's, I think, an interesting thing to think about that we have essentially stopped thinking about supportive research as much as we used to, and have focused far more on online learning. And I think that there's a long-term impact there that we need to think through. At many libraries, there was a conversion of print to digital acquisitions. This varies tremendously. My library, I think, like Nottingham Trent, was pretty heavily E. And so it was a much easier shift for us. There are schools that didn't have E-preferred approval plans for their monographs and had to convert entirely. And so that's a change that I think impacts researchers at different institutions very differently, right? Because some of us were already there. Many universities relied on ETAS, the HathiTrust Emergency Temporary Access Service, which is a controlled digital lending service, essentially, where if you're a member of HathiTrust and you have a book in your collection, you can then use the HathiTrust ebook version to provide to your students. And there are libraries actually that have kept their print collections offline because it allows them to continue to rely on this service. Next slide, please. One of the things that seems to be playing out is that we are clearly being bolder about walking away from the big deal than we were even a year ago. This obviously was a trend we were starting to see. California Digital Library in the US led the way there, and others were starting to sort of have the same conversations. But it's now much more about saving money than about transformative deals to move to open access, right? It is just about how can I decrease my expense. So paradoxically, open access is more important than ever before. We see that, right? So we could have used open access to access far more material than we can at many institutions, but it's a harder thing to achieve. Part of that is just the structure of funding in the US, but I think it's the reality is that as our budgets are decreasing and we're cutting our big deals, that doesn't seem to be converting into transformative agreements. So I wonder whether this scarcity in the form of broken big deals will ultimately lead to a greater institutional support for open access, and I hope so. But I also worry that we're sort of at a point where we've actually lost some ground in this movement. Next slide. Another thing to think about is ranking and reputation, and certainly universities pay a lot of attention to this, even though all universities say that the rankings don't matter and are not really valid, but we all pay attention to them. Many of us have been providing library support for research information management, partly with the goal of helping to improve ranking and reputation. And I think that there's going to be more emphasis on that, especially as we are all trying to attract a smaller pool of students, and at least in the US, a smaller pool of international students coming to the same number of schools. I wonder whether the response to the pandemic will reshape rankings in terms of sort of what the reputation of the institution is and how the institution came through the pandemic, how we're perceived. And then will publication and citation patterns change enough at different institutions to reshape rankings? Probably so at some institutions. Next slide. So some predictions and some concluding thoughts. I think fairly obviously, this isn't a prediction. I think this is just fact. Library budgets aren't going to recover for 3 to 5 years, and I think some probably never will. Right. So once they get cut, it's hard to bring that money back. I think that print is now a specialized resource. Even for those of us who have millions of volumes in our libraries, print is now something that we have to think about differently. We have to think about our print collection as a specialized collection and think much more carefully about how that works in this larger digital collection. And I touched on this before, but we've tipped pretty heavily towards supporting teaching by working with open educational resources, by helping with online learning for the institution, by helping the university convert to this new normal. And I think it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to require a conscious effort to try to reclaim the support of research as a key library function, right? We need to think through what that looks like and how we can make that case going forward. So that's my last slide, and I'm happy to. And I realized I forgot. I never put in a transition slide or a thank you slide, but I will take some questions or a question.
A question. Does anybody have a question for Michael? If not, Michael, I'd like to ask you, why are you so pessimistic about budgets? I mean, 3 to 5 years, I've been on some Australian webinars recently, and I mean, they've been cut 25, 30%, some of them, and they say that they think they'll be back on track in 2022.
So part of it is for public institutions, the reliance on state funding. And so tax revenue is down, right, it'll take a few years for that to recover. And there's always sort of a trailing year or so. There's one of the things that seems that people are very worried about is that our tuition revenue and our enrollment numbers are going to be down dramatically next year, even if we're back to normal next year, because students weren't able to visit schools, right? The process of going around and visiting universities just isn't happening. And so there's great worry about the enrollment next year. And then I think that there's a, you know, if you're a family that has taken a financial hit from this, and even if you sort of get reemployed next year, it maybe takes another year or two to be able to be confident and comfortable enough to think about paying for tuition. And even those who do come back to school, if family budgets are decreased, I think even those who do come back will be paying a more discounted tuition rate. And so that's sort of my thinking. We've heard from colleagues at many state schools that their university has told them to plan for a 3-year downturn, right? So the University of California system, for instance, has been told to plan for 3 years of decreased budget.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for a fascinating presentation, Michael. So Gernot, would you like to come on now, please?
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the possibility to give a little bit of insight in the German perspectives about open access. So actually we are facing the same problems like in UK or in USA, that we have to change from a presence university from one day to another to a digital university where all the teaching is done on a digital way. But I don't want to talk a lot about teaching, so I want to stress more or less the research, and I want to show some steps to access, to open access, and how we are performing this in Germany, or some initiatives we are doing in Germany to perform a transformation from the subscription-based system to an open access system. So please, the next slide. The first thing I want to talk about is why is access to scholarly literature and free access to scholarly literature as important as we see it here in Germany, as I see it personally. Next slide. So if we are looking to COVID-19, I want to go further back one step to Ebola. If we were in the situation where the virus Ebola was in Africa, we saw the first time that researchers, even in Africa, in low-income countries, couldn't really read the relevant literature. They had really problems to get the relevant literature. It was very expensive for them. They have to spend half of a monthly income to get one article. So that was the first reaction to this virus, that some publisher lifted the paywalls for 2 months. In 2 months, the access to this literature was free for the researchers. Within COVID-19, we had this situation again. So we needed access to literature, to the related literature. We need the free access. We need the immediate access to the related literature. So there are a lot of COVID-19 hubs were established. For example, one of the Center of Life Medicine, ZBMed, here in Germany, or also some COVID-19 hubs at PubMed and other places. So it was important to have access to the literature and immediate access to the literature. This includes also not to wait until a peer review has to be performed, but also before the literature is reviewed, just to publish the preprint, to publish the manuscript, the author manuscript. That knowledge has to be shared immediately after the knowledge is generated. Next slide, please. So why openness? It's just because we have to reduce the cost, especially as I've mentioned before, it was the case of Ebola in lower income countries.
I think we've lost you, Gernot. You've frozen and we can't hear you.
Hi, Linda.
Ah, that's better. Thank you.
Can you hear me again? So I'm
Yeah.
sorry
So,
for that.
so we got up to lower income countries. We heard that bit. So you were on to accelerate research.
Okay. Especially for lower income country, it's really important to reduce the cost for research articles, because they really can't afford to pay for an article a lot of money. And also in the case of COVID-19, where really a pandemic effect we have to accelerate research. So really we have to make a further step to know how infections are moving through our countries, and we have to do research on vaccines and so on. But also we have to make an open access to research, because a lot of political decisions are based on scientific knowledge nowadays. So if you're looking about the closure of schools or a general lockdown in countries, they have to justify this restrictions by scientific decisions. So there are a lot of scientists ask about why is a lockdown really necessary, and to make this information clearly open for everyone, it's much more easier that the public can accept this really lockdowns in our cities, in our states, and so on. So it has to be really a confidence in the scientific research that everyone is accepting the political decisions. Next slide, please. So if we are talking about this point that political decisions are affected by science, we have to talk also about how does some political institutions really support openness and support open access. Next slide. So when we are looking at the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, they have made a strategy, a digital strategy. It was 1 year ago, just before the COVID-19 crisis. And there was the aim that by 2025, 70% of all new scientific publications in Germany will be published exclusively or additional via open access. So we see that there is really a need in Germany, or it's really a mark given by the ministry that we have to, or that our researchers have to publish open access, but it isn't told how open access it is. So it isn't told that it's gold open access, it's published directly open access for research, or is it in the green way where just an additional copy is made available open access. But at least there is an aim for 70% by the year 2025. Next slide, please. But if you're looking in Germany, we have also this federal state system, so that different federal states have very different approach to open access with different political guidelines, or even in some states there aren't any aims about open access. So that's a little bit difficult for us, because we don't have one point of view in whole Germany. We have different views in each state. So we have to see how to react in each state. So states with policy, for example, I've mentioned there on the slide, are Hamburg, Berlin, Thuringia, Schleswig-Holstein, Baden-Württemberg, but there are a lot of states which doesn't have really guidelines, political guidelines or policies or mandates where we have to fulfill open access. So we see here it's really a heterogeneous landscape, and it differs from one state to the other. Next slide, please. And in Germany, we have one big research founder. That's
You've frozen again, Gernot, sorry. Hello, Gernot, you've frozen again.
Can you hear me again?
That's better, yes. So if you start again talking about the DFG, please. Thank you.
Sorry about that, but I didn't have it before. About the DFG, they don't mandate open access. They can't mandate open access because in Germany we have this freedom of research, and the freedom of research includes also the freedom of selecting the place to publish, and it doesn't have to be open access. But they strongly recommend open access. So in the guidelines, there's written that everyone has to publish open access if it's possible, and to place also one copy in a discipline-specific or an institutional archive. And also the German Research Foundation supports the Plan S. So they're a supporter of open access, but they don't mandate open access. So each researcher is free to publish either open access nor in a closed access journal. But at least there is a strong support of this from a beginning of the publications, but also for the research data. Okay, next slide, please. So if we are leaving this point of view from the politics, we want to see how is it really done in the real world. So what initiatives are there to support open access? Actually, we are a little bit lucky in Germany because we started before COVID-19 with negotiations with different publishers about open access and about this transformative agreements. Next slide, please. So the first one, the big one, is the so-called DEAL initiative. The DEAL initiative is a project which is a negotiation with three big publishers, the three biggest publishers, and it's nationwide. So all German institutions, including university, including research institutions like the Max Planck Gesellschaft, are really taking part in these negotiations. And fortunately, last year, the first contract were made with the publisher Wiley and the publisher Springer followed this year at the January. And within this contract, it's really a publish and read contract. That means that all calculations are done by publications. So we are now paying a fee for all publications, and then we are paying additional read fee for the permanent access and the archives and the reading for the non-open access articles. So within this contracts, we are really changed its point of view from reading to publishing. That's the first point. Included in this deal contracts, there are subscription-based journals. So we have this hybrid access, but we are also included pure open access journals. So if a researcher publishes in a journal from Wiley or Springer, they can really choose the open access option and they don't have to pay for the open access. The license is Creative Commons. Normally we prefer CC BY, but sometimes there are more restriction about that. So important for us is that this really, we have two contracts now. They are for 2 or 3 years that we are really forced to have every publication open access, and every researcher can choose open access without paying for this open access choice. Okay, next slide, please. There was a lot of criticism about the DEAL project because the DEAL project, as I mentioned before, just has negotiation with the 3 big publishers. But the DFG has set up a tender for transformative contracts, and within this transformative agreements, there are the smaller publishers also included. So without DEAL, within DEAL, we just have the 3 publishers, but all the other publishers have the possibility to make a project together with some libraries in Germany and to make equivalent contracts with the consortia of German libraries. So really that is the intention, that every publisher can make this transformative agreements with libraries in Germany. Within this project, there always has to be a part of reporting from the open access that's clear from the point of view that we as a library really need the numbers of how many articles are published by one university, by another universities. But it's also within this project that new workflows have to be generated, because as a point of library, when we look at this transformative agreements, our point changes dramatically. We don't have to pay once a year for the whole year as a subscription fee, but now we have to pay for each publications, we have to follow publications and so on. That's not as easy as paying for subscription fees. So also in this project, there is always some part about generating new workflows. There are some contracts already done within this project. For example, one of the enormous e-library, or the Cambridge University Press, or BMG now. The second part about this transformative agreements within the DFG, within this tender, is really to develop more workflows for academic institutions. As I've mentioned before, it's really a dramatic change for us at a university library to handle all this publication costs. So now we have to make new workflows, we have to generate new workflows, we have to evaluate workflows, how we can handle this enormous amount of invoices we are getting, and how to really reach our researchers that they know that they can choose this open access possibility without paying for it. Okay, thank you. The next slide, please. One thing I want to mention explicitly is open access to books. Because if we are looking at open access, we're always talking about articles, we're talking about journals, we're talking about natural sciences. But if really open access is an accelerator to science, then we must be able to every scholarly literature. So even to scholarly literature, which is for the humanities or for social science, and these are the so-called book-oriented scholarship. So we really have to take into account that humanities, social sciences also have to participate in this open access movement. So in Germany, there are numerous projects which include books in the open access movement. There are books, for example, for this, politics, for IT, law, and so there are some books, mostly often are they combined with knowledge unlatched or with other business models. So there is some kind of trying out which business model works for open access books. Even for books, it's not as easy as for a single article to get open access. The book has another, there are other things to consider. So there are recommendations for OA books. So if we are choosing a project for books, we are really looking at these recommendations. There are some hints how books have to be published to be real open access and to gain from these projects. Okay, the next slide, please. So we see there are a lot of projects within the German community, and there are a lot of projects which we are trying to perform. But we have still this problem that each university works for its own, and that it's a little bit difficult for each university to know how to do the workflows, to know about all this information of open access, of the projects and so on. So there is established this so-called National Open Access Contact Point, which accompanies the transformation process on a national level. So what we are doing at this National Open Access Contact Point is to suggest how local implementations can be done, and so to make workflows, best practice about workflows. We analyze publications and costs. This is also a new task for us. A lot of libraries. Libraries are not used to count publications, or a lot of librarians are not used to count publications and to compare publications with costs and even with additional costs like color charges, page charges, and so on. They don't know about this. So we are trying to give an insight about this, but also to develop new business models. Even in this case of open access books, there are no well-established business models, and we try new business models, how to make this transformative process really going on. And also very important to make information for academic institutions, like about this deal projects and so on, that everybody has the same information, everybody's well informed about this. Even they are conducting some pilot projects, there are some APC consortia project, but there is also some journal flipping, or as I mentioned, this book project like this IT law project, and even for library information, some project like that's the biggest journal of library information science is switched to open access within this model, subscribe to open. So we really try to make transformative agreements with different business models and see which business model is working and which business model is failing. So it's a little bit of try and error. Okay, next slide, please. This is about another initiatives we are doing in Germany. It's the so-called open access monitor. What we are doing here is monitoring the publication status in Germany. We see how many publications are open access, in which status they are open access. Important is that each institution in Germany, each university can have a look at this open access monitor. We see the whole picture, but we can also look at one university at a time. So we see, for example, at Regensburg exactly how much open access we have. Okay, next slide, please. What we see is that open access is the new default when we are looking at all these transformative agreements. Normally, if a researcher is approaching the publisher says open access is the default, and if he doesn't want to publish open access, he has to choose it by hand. So next slide, please. So if you see that open access really increases the number of open access publications, if we make a comparison before deal in 2018, now with deal 2020, we see, especially in hybrid open access, that we have an increase from 7% to 19%. So really, we see here the effect of deal that now a lot of hybrid open access publications are open access at this moment. We see also a little increase of gold open access. We don't know if this is an effect of the COVID pandemic, but it can also be just an effect about public relationship from deals, so that open access is better known in Germany. But there are still a lot of concern about payment and additional costs for researchers if they're publishing open access. So there is still a lot of work to do for providing really information to researchers that open access nowadays in Germany is often free. Okay, next slide, please. For the future, if we are looking in the future, we have also this problem we had mentioned before, that we are really getting a cut in the budget. And if we are getting a cut in the budget, it's not easy to have open access anymore, maybe, or maybe it's because we have this contract with two publishers, which runs for 2 years, 3 years. So we can't cancel this contract. Maybe we have to be forced into this contract and we have to be forced in open access. We don't know by now. But if you're looking at the lesson learned, please the next slide. So I think that even in this period of global crisis like COVID-19, we know that access is a key point to accelerate scientific knowledge, which is one point. But also, if we have something like this global crisis, we have global corporations to really come to an end of this crisis. So open access allows the international cooperation. It guarantees knowledge to the whole scientific world, or to the whole world at all. Everyone can have a look at the knowledge, at the scientific publications, but this is important, that really everyone who pays the taxes can have a look at the result of research. And it also strengthens the trust in scholarship and related decisions. So if we have some decisions from politics, like the lockdown or so on, it can be really based on a scientific groundment. But what we still have to do, we have to make a transfer to all disciplines. So if we see the natural sciences are one step advanced with open access, and this has to be adapted also to other disciplines like humanities. And we have to apply open science, so it doesn't, openness is not just for the publications, it's also for the data beyond, for the research data and beyond, and other problems which we have, which really is for our living here important, like the climate change, might be able to be better understandable and better treatable if we have really access to scientific literature, to the scientific background. Thank you very much. So I'm very interested for your questions.
Thank you, Gernot, very much. Would anybody like to ask Gernot a question? If not, I've got several questions that I was sent in advance. And I'm going to ask this one first because it seems to be the most relevant. And I'm going to start with Helen, but I'd like you to all answer it. And that is there still the same appetite for experimentation with new business models as there was before the pandemic? So Helen.
Oh, I think the appetite is there. It's whether the resources are there to back it up. I mean, you could say that the new deal that we've got in the UK for e-textbooks and the reality of the situation whereby a lot of the content that our customers need and want to use is only available under that is making librarians engage with business models that they've avoided in the past. I think that's not so much about appetite as necessity. You know, if you have an academic who says, I am going to use this book for my core teaching and it's only available on that sort of new business model, then the library and the university has to find some way of responding to it. So I think what we are trying to do is encourage our academics to look beyond what they've always done and to look at other materials as well. But we've got a situation at Nottingham Trent where the academics in this case have written the book that happens to be only available on an e-textbook model, and encouraging them to choose someone else's book is just not going to happen. So the appetite, I think, is there amongst librarians. I don't think it's there amongst our academic staff. I think they're so busy and so engaged in trying to translate their teaching into an effective and engaging online experience that the idea that they might think beyond how they've always done it is a step too far for them at the moment. That's how it feels to me anyway.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, so I think that there is an appetite for new business models, and probably a greater appetite and necessity than there was 6 months ago. To the extent that new business models can help us, especially those institutions that haven't yet converted to fully to E, but can help us move more rapidly to E, and can help us provide more content more efficiently, right? So none of us probably can afford new business models or experimenting with things that are going to raise our costs. But if we can make trade-offs in access, for instance, where we are not paying for perpetual access, but just paying for use, or if we're doing things like evidence-based acquisition, which I'm not even positive is a new business model anymore, but things like evidence-based acquisition, if you haven't been ready to do that yet, this might be the time that as an institution you'd be ready to move in that direction, right? So things that can provide our users with e-content and can do so sort of as broadly as possible, I think there's probably an appetite for that.
Thank you. So Gernot, I mean, you've obviously been experimenting with lots of new models, partly out of necessity, I guess. There is another question up on the screen now, which is, has there been any pushback against open publication? And I guess that means with academics. And you are an academic yourself, aren't you? You publish yourself as well. So how do you feel about publishing your own works via open access? Sorry, we can't hear you. Could you get closer to the microphone?
Actually, I'm publishing all my work open access. and to make it also reusable. So I think what we haven't talked about, and if we are talking about new business model, we also have to talk about the licensing we are publishing. So I've mentioned the CC BY license, and this is important in the digital age now. If we are talking about open educational resources, if you're looking at our university, a lot of researchers, if they are teaching, are afraid of making their slides open access because they are afraid of copyright frauds. So I think that's an important point if you're talking about business models, about how to reuse the information we are getting, that they can be reused in slides for lectures and so on, and they can be made open available.
Thank you. And Michael, I'd like to pick up on that point in the context of OERs, because you say there is greater interest in OERs, that's open education resources, but quite a lot of the research that Annika and I have done shows that OERs aren't really OERs, and that academics want to keep them within their own university. They don't want to share them beyond the confines of their own university. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, so I think that there is a very mixed uptake on OER, and it's, so there are teachers who I think are committed to teaching with open resources, and obviously they're committed to it for the same reasons I think that librarians are generally committed to open. They want to save money for their students. They want to contribute to a movement toward open, and so I think we almost need to just set that group aside because we don't need to persuade them of anything. You know, and then I think there's a much bigger group that just wants to save their students money, and I think they're just as happy with a book that the library has licensed. And not necessarily interested in educational resources. They're interested in free to the student, and then there's sort of the other challenge of they want to teach with an open educational resource, but they don't think the open resources are actually good enough for their particular need, right? So I think we still have a ways to go, and I think there's some of it is about the persuading the teachers, and some of it is about just what's available, and some of it is about, I think, different rationales for why they're pursuing this, right? Whether it's about open per se or whether it's about free to the student, which are different things.
Thank you. And in connection with that, Helen, you said that you'd been giving a lot of support to academics to develop courses that weren't just Zoom courses, but they were a bit more dynamic. Are you using any particular software or tools for that, or is it more about coaching them how to teach in a different way?
I think it's a combination of the two. It's more primarily the latter, about you know, getting them to plan their teaching in a different way, and you know, possibly instead of just an over-reliance on a single resource, bringing in multiple types of resources and content to basically make it a more interesting experience. We are, I think, constrained to some extent by what is possible within our virtual learning environment, but you know, what they've been trying to do is help academics. I mentioned we've got a team of sort of learning technologists. They've developed templates and, you know, encouraged academics to think about things in a different way. You know, the way they design their learning rooms visually. It's been more to do with presentation, I think, than content as such.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in?
Sorry, yes.
Can I just jump in there really quickly and I'll just sort of echo that and say that you know, at my university, our Office of Teaching and Learning hired a bunch of instructional designers, and they hired more people to help with teaching people how to teach online, and I think that's probably true at pretty much every university. Thank you.
So we're just about out of time, but before I thank you again, and they were stellar presentations. Thank you all very much indeed. I'm just going to ask Deirdre if she'd like to have a last say. Is there anything you'd like to ask our speakers, Deirdre?
You are still muted.
You're muted, Deirdre, sorry.
Okay, final point. I am wondering whether we are going to see a real shift to e-materials, or are we going to get more people just simply printing them out? I know I've had that anecdotally from humanities researchers. I just wondered if you know, we are seeing people actually reading and learning online, or are they just downloading and printing back to the way that they used to? Or is it still too early to tell?
Helen, would you like to start with that?
I think it is too early to tell. At the moment, all the evidence is that they're reading online, because it's quite extraordinary this week. We spent all this time setting up a booking system, envisaging that the demand for space in the library would be such that we had to manage it. And in actual fact, that's just not happened. They are staying wherever they are, and they're putting in requests to have things supplied as an ebook. So unless they're printing using their own printers and then doing it that way, which we suspect not, because printing costs is a core complaint usually from our students, I think they really are, you know, starting to read online rather than, you know, the old days when they just print it out and highlight, and that somehow made it magically into their heads, I think. So yes.
Thank you. Michael, would you agree with that?
Yeah, so I actually don't know. I do agree with the cost issue. So while the library was closed, and while essentially campus was closed and there was nowhere to print for free, I do wonder if and I think for at least some of our ebook packages, we could identify printing. But it would be interesting to know whether there was a decline in printing during this time period when we were online only, and there was nowhere to print for free. Because I agree, if you are printing 50 or 100 or 1,000 pages and it's free to you, the university's paying for it, it's very different than, you know, having to pay for the toner and the paper at home. So I don't know if that has changed or not. I do know, you know, we've had ebooks at the University of Denver since Net Library formed, and which is, I think, 2000 or 1999, something like that. Actually. Okay, yeah. So they were founded in, you know, 20 miles from here, and so we were actually their first customer, or the Colorado Alliance of Research Libraries was. But anyway, you know, people have been printing all along, and I do wonder if the fact that the circumstance was different and they had to use it and they had no way of using print at all maybe changed it. It seems like something that could be identified fairly easily by looking at usage data.
Another Deirdre silver linings, in fact. Gernot, in all these contracts that you've been negotiating, is the amount that printing is allowed, it's usually something like 10% of the book, isn't it? Is that a factor? Has that been a sticking point in any of the negotiations?
I think printing is still important for researchers. Mm-hmm. And if we are negotiation with most of them, we are always try to include printing, mm-hmm. because it's easier to read sometimes. But I think if I'm going one step back about are still printed copies used, I think we have to look at the different type of students. So if we are looking at the new students, which are digital natives, they really are used to read on the screens, read on their tablets, on their phones and so on. But we really have to provide our information in a format that is easy readable in these devices, so that it's easy readable on smartphones and so on, because they are really used to read on the smartphones and not on the printed copy anymore. I think that's really a question about how they are used in their normal life to read. But still, we are focused on printing, and we are including printing in every contract we are making, because we see that the researchers still print their copies and they use the printed copies.
Thank you very much. Well, we are out of time now. As I said, those were 3 fascinating presentations. Thank you so much for giving time up. Helen, Michael and Gernot and Deirdre as well. Thank you very much indeed for commissioning the research, for presenting the research and for organising this webinar. And I'd also like to thank Annika and Lavinia who've not appeared on the screen but who've done an awful lot of work behind the scenes as well. Any of the audience, I know that some of you have gone, but anybody who'd still like to ask some questions, if you email them to Lavinia, she'll pass them on to me and we will try to get them answered for you. But thank you very much once again, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.